The paper was a single sheet, folded twice. Silas held it out to her on the porch of the cabin her husband had built, the raw pine boards still smelling of sap and effort. It was October 28th, 1901. Thomas had been in the ground for 6 days. The cold was already settling into the high country around Jericho Springs, a hard, mineral cold that promised a brutal winter. Ilara Finch stood with her hands loose at her sides, not reaching for the document. Her son, Caleb, all of 7 years old, watched from behind her skirts. Inside, 4-year-old Maeve was asleep, a small bundle of warmth against the coming chill. "It's the deed, Ilara," Silas said. His voice was thin, like the air at this elevation of 8,500 feet. He was Thomas's younger brother, a man who had always seemed to be calculating angles, even in grief. "Signed over to me, last year." Thomas knew his lungs were giving out. He wanted to make sure things were taken care of. She finally took the paper. The notary seal in the bottom corner was from a town 100 miles away, dated 11 months prior. The signature that purported to be her husband's was a close imitation, but it lacked the confident, decisive stroke she knew better than her own. It was a forgery, a clumsy one to her eyes, but one that bore the weight of law. She felt no surge of rage, no hot tears. Instead, a profound and terrifying clarity settled over her. This was not a negotiation. It was an eviction. "He never mentioned this to me," she said. Her voice was flat, a statement of fact, not an accusation. "He didn't want to worry you," Silas said, not meeting her gaze. He looked past her, at the stand of aspen Thomas had so carefully preserved, their leaves now a shower of gold on the forest floor. "The mining company holds a lien on this land anyway. My taking it on is a formality. It saves you the trouble." This was the second lie. Thomas, a geologist by training, had chosen this parcel specifically because it was outside the company's claim. He had paid for it in cash, with savings from 3 years of careful work. The deed, the real one, was in a lockbox in the town's bank, but she had no access to it, not without a husband. "I have 2 children," she said, the words falling like stones into the quiet air. Silas finally looked at her. His eyes were small and impatient. "I'm not a monster, Ilara. I'll give you $50 for your trouble and for the furniture. It should be enough to get you and the children on the stagecoach to Denver. You have family there, I imagine." She had no family there. She had no family anywhere. Her parents were gone, lost to cholera a decade ago. Thomas had been her family. Now Caleb and Maeve were her nation, a population of 2 she was sworn to protect. "Shaku Mariano, you have until the end of the week," Silas added, his tone hardening now that the difficult part was over. "That's 5 days. I'll be back on Saturday with the money." He turned and walked away without another word, his boots crunching on the gravel path Thomas had laid. Ilara stood on the porch, the forged deed fluttering slightly in the breeze. She watched until he disappeared down the track, a small, dark figure against the immense backdrop of the granite peaks. Caleb's small hand tightened its grip on her dress. "Is Uncle Silas angry?" he asked. Ilara folded the paper neatly and tucked it into her apron pocket. She looked down at her son, at his serious, worried face that was so much like his father's. "No, darling," she said, her voice steady. "He's just making arrangements." She would not give Silas the satisfaction of her fear, not even in front of her own child. She would not give this cold cruelty the power of her tears. The sun was beginning to dip behind the western ridge, and the temperature was already dropping. She ushered Caleb back inside, closing the heavy pine door on the world that had just been stolen from them. The cabin was warm from the morning's fire, but the warmth felt temporary, a memory of a life that was already over. That night, after the children were asleep in the small loft bed Thomas had built, Ilara sat at the kitchen table. The oil lamp cast a circle of yellow light on the smooth, worn wood. She laid out her entire world for inspection. In a small tin box where she kept household money, she had $18.42. Silas's $50, if he even brought it, would bring her total to $68.42. This was the sum total of her financial existence. She took out a pencil and a scrap of paper and began to calculate. A stagecoach ticket to Denver for one adult and one child, Maeve was small enough to ride on her lap, was $32. That would leave her with $36 and change upon arrival in a city where she knew no one. A room in a respectable boarding house, one that would even accept children, cost at least $4 a week. Food would be another $3. She could last perhaps 5 weeks, 6 if she was frugal to the point of starvation. And then what? She was 31 years old. The work available to a woman in her position was laundry, mending, or domestic service. These jobs were for young, unburdened girls who could work 14-hour days and sleep in an attic cot. They were not for a widow with 2 small children who would need constant care. The math was simple and brutal. Denver was a dead end, a slower, more anonymous way to perish. She crossed out the Denver calculation. What were the options here, in Jericho Springs? The town was a company town, built around the silver mine. The only work was mining for the men and servicing the miners for the women. She could not work in the saloons or the boarding houses for the same reason she couldn't in Denver. The few respectable families had no need for a housekeeper. She could perhaps take in laundry, but she no longer had a house. The 5 days Silas had given her were a countdown to homelessness. She sat back, the pencil resting on the paper. The numbers stared up at her, stark and unforgiving. She felt the cold press in, not from the outside, but from within. It was the chill of absolute solitude. She was a ship cut from its moorings, adrift on a vast and indifferent sea. Thomas was gone. His strength, his quiet competence, his deep well of geological knowledge, it was all gone. All that remained was her, and the 2 small, breathing lives in the loft above. Self-pity was a luxury she could not afford. It was fuel burned for no heat. She pushed it away and focused on the facts. They had $68. They had 5 days. Winter was not coming. It was here. The first snows often fell in early November, and by December, the passes would be closed. The temperature would drop to 20, sometimes 30 below zero. Snow would bury everything under a blanket 6 feet deep. Survival in this country was a matter of engineering, of calories and BT-us, of shelter and fuel. She had none of these things. Her eyes fell on a small shelf near the stove. It held Thomas's field ledgers, a dozen small, leather-bound notebooks filled with his precise, angular handwriting. He had been a man who observed the world with scientific rigor. He didn't just see mountains. He saw granite uplifts, limestone strata, glacial moraines. He recorded everything: rock compositions, fissure patterns, water tables. She had loved this about him, his ability to read the story the land was telling. It had made her feel safe, as if the world, for all its chaos, was ultimately legible, governed by laws of physics and time. Now it just felt like a cruel reminder of all she had lost. She picked up the most recent ledger, the one from the previous summer. She flipped through the pages, seeing sketches of rock formations, notes on mineral deposits. It felt like an intrusion, a conversation she was no longer a part of. She was about to put it back when a particular page caught her eye. It was a detailed sketch, not of a rock face, but of a specific location. She recognized it instantly. It was a place about 2 miles up the southern flank of Sentinel Peak, a place he had taken her and Caleb to on a picnic just before the first signs of his illness had appeared. He had called it the Sun Pocket. The drawing was annotated with his meticulous notes. South-facing limestone outcrop, one note read. Natural overhang, approximately 20 feet deep, 15 feet wide. Dry floor, excellent drainage. Protected from north wind. Another arrow pointed to the rock itself. High thermal mass. Absorbs solar radiation all day. Releases heat slowly overnight. At the bottom of the page, he had written a summary, as if for a formal report. A remarkable geological anomaly. A natural passive solar structure. Could maintain a temperature 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient in winter conditions, with minimal additional heat source. She stared at the drawing, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. It wasn't a memory of a picnic. It was a blueprint. Thomas hadn't been showing off his knowledge that day. He had been teaching her, sharing a secret the land had told him. He was a man who planned, who saw possibilities and contingencies everywhere. He could not have known that Silas would betray him, that she would be cast out. But in his careful, methodical way, he had left her an inheritance. It wasn't money or property. It was knowledge. It was a location. It was a chance. She looked from the ledger to the cold, dark windows of the cabin that was no longer hers. A new calculation began to form in her mind, one not of dollars and cents, but of stone and sun and firewood. She was not alone, not entirely. A part of him, the most practical and wisest part, was still with her, captured in ink on a page. This could work. This could actually work. The next morning, she woke the children before dawn. The air in the cabin was frigid. She dressed them in their warmest clothes, layering shirts and sweaters. "We're going on an adventure," she told them, her voice more confident than she felt. "To a special place Daddy found." Caleb, old enough to sense the tension beneath her words, was quiet and watchful. Maeve was simply excited at the prospect of an early morning walk. Ilara packed a small bag with what was left of their bread, a piece of cheese, and a canteen of water. She left everything else. She would be back for what she could carry, but for now, speed and secrecy were paramount. She didn't want to risk running into Silas or any of his cronies. They set out as the first light touched the highest peaks, painting them a pale, ethereal pink. The 2-mile walk was an ascent of nearly 1,000 feet. The path was steep, littered with fallen timber and loose rock. Maeve's small legs tired quickly, and Ilara had to carry her for long stretches, the child's weight a familiar grounding burden. Caleb walked ahead, his small figure a study in determination, occasionally looking back to make sure she was still following. The air grew thinner, colder. The ponderosa pines gave way to hardy scrub oak and juniper. Ilara followed the map in her memory, guided by Thomas's remembered words and the shape of the ridgeline against the sky. He had pointed out the landmarks, a twisted, lightning-scarred pine, a distinctive outcrop of granite that looked like a seated man. After nearly 2 hours of hard climbing, she found it. The entrance was cleverly concealed, tucked behind a thicket of mountain laurel and a curtain of dry, hanging moss. From 50 feet away, it was invisible, just another part of the rock face. But as she pushed aside the branches, the opening revealed itself. It was exactly as Thomas had sketched it, a wide, low arch in a vast wall of pale gray limestone. The ground sloped away from the entrance, ensuring no water would pool inside. The opening faced due south, and even now in the early morning, the sunlight was beginning to pour directly into it. She set Maeve down and took Caleb's hand, and they stepped inside. The air was still and noticeably warmer than the biting wind outside. The main chamber was larger than she had remembered, a rough oval about 20 feet deep and perhaps 16 feet across at its widest point. The ceiling was a solid vault of stone, 10 feet high at the center, sloping down toward the back. The floor was not dirt, but smooth, packed stone, completely dry. To the right, a smaller opening led to a second, narrower chamber, a kind of natural pantry or storage room. There was a faint, clean smell of rock dust and dry earth. A thin crack high in the back wall seemed to lead upwards, a natural flue that would draw smoke if she were to build a fire near the entrance. She walked to the back of the cave and placed her hand against the limestone wall. It was cool, but not the deep, damp cold of granite. It felt solid, ancient, and protective. She could see how it would work. The low winter sun would shine into the cave for most of the day, heating the massive stone walls and floor. At night, as the temperature outside plummeted, the rock would slowly radiate that stored heat back into the space, creating a thermal flywheel that would moderate the extremes of the climate. It was a perfect, natural machine for survival. Thomas had seen it, understood it, and left it for her. "This is it," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet space. "This will be our home." Caleb looked around, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "We're going to live in a cave?" Maeve, however, was delighted. She ran to the smaller chamber, her footsteps making small pattering sounds. "It's my room," she declared. Ilara watched them, a fierce, protective love swelling in her chest. This was not the life she had imagined for them. It was a desperate, precarious existence. But it was an existence. They would not freeze on the streets of Denver. They would not starve at the mercy of a town that had no place for them. They would survive, here, in this pocket of sun and stone. She had a shelter. Now, she needed to provision it. She left the children in the cave with the last of the bread and the canteen of water, making Caleb promise to keep Maeve away from the entrance. It was a terrible risk, leaving them alone, but it was a calculated one. She could not haul supplies up the mountain with a 4-year-old on her hip. She walked back down to Jericho Springs, her mind a whirlwind of lists and priorities. She had $68 and a few days to turn this empty space into a fortress against the winter. The bell on the door of Abernathy's General Mercantile tinkled, a sound of ordinary commerce that felt alien to her current reality. The store was a cavern of scents: coffee beans, cured leather, kerosene, and cinnamon. Mr. Abernathy stood behind the counter, a tall, stooped man with kind, watery eyes and a fringe of white hair. He had been a friend of Thomas's. They had shared an interest in geology and local history. "Mrs. Finch," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I was sorry to hear about Thomas. A good man." "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice tight. "I need to purchase some supplies." He nodded, his gaze taking in her worn dress, the determined set of her jaw. "What can I get for you?" She began her list, each item a carefully considered weapon in her war against the cold. "A good shovel, the best one you have." He pulled one down, its steel blade gleaming. $3.50, he said. A pickaxe. I've only got heads. Handle you'll have to make yourself. $2. She nodded. 20 yards of heavy canvas tarp. He measured it out from a large roll, the thick, oiled fabric smelling of waterproofing. $10. A box of 50 nails, 50 cents. 100 feet of good rope. $1.50. Two 50-pound sacks of flour. $5. A 20-pound sack of pinto beans. $2. 10 pounds of salt pork. $3. 5 pounds of lard. $1. A sack of salt. A box of baking soda. A large box of matches. Another $1. The pile on the counter grew, a testament to her dwindling funds. She spent with the precision of a surgeon, choosing only the items essential for long-term survival. No sugar, no coffee, no small comforts, only calories, tools, and shelter. The total came to $30, almost half of her entire fortune. The remaining money would have to last her until spring, for anything she might have forgotten. As Mr. Abernathy was tying twine around the sacks of flour, he paused. "Heard Silas say you were heading to Denver," he said, not looking at her. "Silas is mistaken," Ilara replied evenly. Mr. Abernathy continued his work, his hands slow and deliberate. He knew the ways of this town, the casual cruelties and the sudden hardships. He had seen women like her before, left with nothing but their own grit. He finished tying the knots and then walked to the back of the store. He returned with a small, sharp handsaw. "Thomas left this here last year to be sharpened," he said. "Never got around to picking it up. You should take it." He then added a small sack of dried apples, a whetstone for the axe and saw, and 2 pairs of thick wool socks, sized for her children. He placed them with her other purchases. "How much for these?" she asked, knowing she couldn't afford them. He shook his head. "No charge. Thomas was a good customer. Call it a credit on his account." He looked at her directly then, his gaze steady and full of an unspoken understanding. "The first big snow is never more than a week or 2 off this time of year. Be careful up there, Mrs. Finch." He knew. He didn't know the specifics, but he knew she wasn't going to Denver. He knew she was heading for the high country, and he was offering what help he could. A small gesture of solidarity in a world that had turned its back on her. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "I have a wagon going up to the Miller homestead tomorrow with supplies," he said. "It passes the trailhead to Sentinel Peak. My boy can give you and your things a ride that far. Be here at dawn." The next 4 weeks were a blur of relentless, punishing labor. Each day, Ilara rose before the sun, her body aching from the previous day's work, and began the methodical process of turning a cave into a home. Her first task was to create a barrier against the wind. Using the pickaxe and shovel, she cleared the loose rock and soil from the front of the cave entrance, creating a level foundation. Then, she began to build a wall. She gathered the flat, angular pieces of limestone that had fallen from the cliff face over centuries, hefting stones that weighed 50 or 60 pounds. She dry stacked them, fitting them together like a puzzle, the larger stones at the base, the smaller ones filling the gaps. It was a technique Thomas had explained to her once, pointing out old trappers' cabins. A well-built dry stack wall didn't need mortar. Its strength came from gravity and friction. She built it 4 feet high and 3 feet thick, a low, solid crescent that wrapped around the front of the cave, leaving a 3-foot opening for a door. The wall didn't seal the cave, but it created a sheltered antechamber, a dead air space that would buffer the living area from the direct assault of the wind. For the door itself, she used the canvas. She found 2 young, straight aspen trees and cut them down with the handsaw, trimming them to form a rough doorframe in the gap she'd left in the wall. She then cut the heavy canvas tarp into 3 sections. She nailed one layer to the outside of the frame and another to the inside, creating an insulated air gap between them. The third piece she hung as a heavy flap inside the cave entrance itself, weighted at the bottom with a heavy branch. It was a system of baffles, designed to trap heat and block drafts. The most critical element was fire. A fire inside the cave would fill it with smoke, and she didn't trust the natural flue enough to risk suffocating her children in their sleep. Instead, she remembered an article Thomas had read to her from a military journal about techniques used by soldiers on the plains. It was called a Dakota fire hole. In the sheltered area behind her new wall, she dug 2 holes about 1 foot in diameter and 2 feet deep, separated by about 3 feet of earth. Then, using the pickaxe, she painstakingly chipped out a tunnel connecting the bottom of the 2 holes. One hole was for the fuel. The other, positioned to catch the prevailing wind, was the air intake. This design created a clean, hot, and incredibly efficient fire. The flames were below ground, protected from the wind, and the air tunnel provided a constant draft that ensured complete combustion, producing maximum heat with minimum smoke. The heat would radiate upwards, warming the stone antechamber and, by extension, the cave itself. It was safer and consumed far less wood than an open fire. Wood was her life. It was the currency of survival. Every hour that the children were asleep or playing safely near the cave, she was foraging. She worked her way across the mountainside, gathering the abundant deadfall, pine, aspen, and juniper. She used the saw to cut the larger pieces into manageable lengths, and a small hatchet she'd brought from the cabin to split them. She hauled the wood on her back, load after grueling load, her muscles screaming in protest. She stacked it in the second, smaller chamber of the cave, organizing it by size and type. Pine for starting fires, aspen for long, slow burns. The woodpile grew, a dense, fragrant wall of fuel that represented security. She calculated her needs obsessively. A family in a drafty cabin might burn a cord of wood a month. Her shelter was more efficient, but she planned for the worst. She aimed to gather enough for 5 months, a monumental task. By the end of October, the woodpile filled the entire side chamber, floor to ceiling. Inside the main cave, she made their living space. She wove beds for them from willow branches, creating raised platforms that would keep them off the cold stone floor. On top of these, she piled thick layers of fragrant pine boughs, which served as both mattress and insulation. Their few blankets went on top of that. She organized their meager food supplies on a natural stone shelf, the flour and beans in their sacks, the salt pork hanging from a rope. Life settled into a rhythm dictated by work, weather, and the needs of her children. It was a brutal, exhausting existence, but it was also honest. Every stone she lifted, every piece of wood she cut, added another layer of security between her family and the vast, indifferent wilderness. She was not just surviving, she was building. And in the building, she found a strange, hard-won peace. The first test came in the second week of November. The sky, which had been a brilliant, hard blue for days, turned a milky, cataract gray. The wind, which had been a constant whisper, rose to a mournful howl. Mr. Abernathy's prediction had come true. The first great blizzard of the season, a storm the old-timers called the Widowmaker, descended on the high country. Ilara had been watching the signs, the behavior of the birds, the ring around the moon, the ache in her own bones. She was as ready as she could be. She brought the last of the cut wood inside the antechamber, stacking it near the Dakota fire hole. She checked the canvas door, packing loose snow into the gaps around the frame to create a solid seal. Then she retreated with the children into the main chamber, pulling the heavy inner canvas flap closed behind them. The world outside disappeared. The roaring wind became a muffled, distant thunder. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire from the antechamber, its faint, welcome warmth radiating through the entrance, and the soft breathing of her children. The storm lasted for 3 days. Snow fell relentlessly, piling up in enormous drifts. The temperature, which she monitored with a small thermometer Thomas had owned, dropped to 10 below zero, then 15, then a terrifying 22 below. Outside their shelter, it was a world of lethal, swirling white. Inside, it was a small sanctuary of calm. The cave performed exactly as Thomas had predicted. The massive limestone walls, saturated with weeks of autumn sun, now bled that heat back into the space. The temperature inside the main chamber never dropped below 45 degrees. It was not warm, but it was survivable. With their wool clothes and thick blankets, they were comfortable. Their days took on a monastic routine. In the morning, Ilara would crawl out to the antechamber, the cold a physical blow, and feed the fire hole. The hot, efficient flame required little tending. She would cook their meals there. A simple porridge of flour and water for breakfast, a thick stew of beans, and a small piece of salt pork for dinner. She rationed their food with grim precision, calculating the calories needed to keep them healthy. She kept a log in the back of Thomas's ledger, noting the date, the outside temperature, and the amount of wood and food consumed. It was a scientific document of their survival. She spent the long hours telling the children stories, drawing pictures with charcoal on smooth stones, and teaching Caleb his letters. They were safe, they were fed, and they were warm. On the 3rd day, the wind died down, and a profound silence fell. Ilara pushed open the outer canvas door and was met with a wall of snow. The storm had buried their entrance completely. For a moment, a flicker of panic went through her, the fear of being entombed. But then she remembered something else Thomas had told her. The deep snow was not a prison. It was insulation. An igloo worked on the same principle. The snow tunnel she would have to dig would protect their entrance from the wind and keep the ambient temperature just below freezing, a vast improvement on 20 below. She took the shovel and began to dig. An hour later, she broke through to the surface. The world was transformed, a blinding expanse of white under a newly cleared, brilliant blue sky. The air was so cold, it hurt to breathe. But they had done it. They had faced the worst the winter could throw at them, and her engineering, Thomas's legacy, had held. They had survived. Word of the woman on Sentinel Peak spread through Jericho Springs in whispers. It began with Mr. Abernathy, who, when asked, would simply say that Mrs. Finch and her children were provided for. Then came the hunters who, tracking deer in the high country after the first storm, saw the faint plume of clean burning smoke rising from an impossible spot on the rock face. They saw her tracks, the evidence of her wood gathering. They saw the neat, solid construction of her low wall. They reported what they saw back in town, and the story took on the quality of a legend. Silas, when he heard the rumors, dismissed them. He told people she had lost her mind with grief and wandered off, or that she had taken his money and left on a midnight stage. He had sold the cabin and the land to a speculator from the mining company and was trying to put the whole affair behind him. The first visitor arrived in early December. It was a young woman named Mary Gable, the wife of a miner who lived in one of the poorly constructed company shacks at the edge of town. Her face was chapped with cold, her eyes wide with desperation. She carried a small, coughing baby bundled in a thin blanket. "They say you know how to stay warm," Mary said, her voice trembling, half from cold, half from fear. "My cabin. The wind comes through the walls. My stove eats wood faster than my husband can cut it. The baby, he's been sick for a week." Ilara brought her inside the cave, into the steady, quiet warmth. She gave her a cup of hot water infused with pine needles, a trick she had learned from one of Thomas's books. She listened as Mary described her situation. It was a story of poverty and poor construction, of a family fighting a losing battle against the cold. Ilara did not offer pity or charity. She offered knowledge. She took Mary outside and showed her the construction of the Dakota fire hole, explaining the principles of airflow and efficient combustion. She showed her how she had sealed the canvas door with packed snow. She drew a diagram in the snow with a stick, illustrating how to build a small, insulated antechamber for their cabin's front door. "Stop trying to heat the whole world," Ilara told her. "Make one small room as airtight as you can. Live in that room. It's not about a bigger fire. It's about holding the heat you have." She gave Mary a bundle of her own dry, seasoned aspen wood. "This will burn slow and hot," she explained. "Your green wood is wasting half its heat just boiling off the water inside it." Mary Gable left that day with a new understanding, and with a small but tangible measure of hope. A week later, her husband came up the mountain with a quarter of a freshly butchered deer, a silent offering of gratitude. Others followed. An old trapper whose own cabin had been damaged in the storm came for advice on rebuilding his chimney. A family of 5, new to the territory, and utterly unprepared for the ferocity of a high-country winter, came to learn how to bank their fire and insulate their floor. Ilara became an unlikely oracle. She never turned anyone away. She shared what she knew, dispensing practical, life-saving information with the calm authority of someone who had tested these principles with her own life. She was no longer just the widow Finch, an object of pity or scorn. She was the woman in the cave, a source of wisdom that was more valuable than gold in the depths of winter. She was, almost without realizing it, becoming the resilient, beating heart of the community that had cast her out. In late January, a new mine superintendent arrived from the head office in Denver. His name was Arthur Davies, a man in his late 40s with a degree in engineering from the Colorado School of Mines. He was a man of systems and efficiencies, sent to Jericho Springs to modernize the operation, and more pressingly, to address the alarming rate of sickness and absenteeism among the miners and their families. He found a workforce plagued by respiratory illnesses, frostbite, and the general malaise that came from being perpetually cold. His foreman told him the problem was the housing. The company cabins were little more than drafty boxes, impossible to heat. "Some of the men have been making improvements," the foreman said. "Learned some tricks from the cave woman up on Sentinel Peak." Davies was skeptical. "The cave woman?" "Finch's widow. Her brother-in-law threw her out. Everyone thought she was dead. Turns out she's been living in a limestone overhang all winter, and thriving by the sound of it." Intrigued, Davies decided to see for himself. He was a practical man who believed in evidence. He made the 2-mile trek up the mountain, following the well-worn path in the snow. He found Ilara splitting wood, her movements economical and strong. He introduced himself, explaining his position and the reason for his visit. Ilara regarded him with her usual calm composure, neither deferential nor hostile. She simply waited for him to state his purpose. He asked if he could see her shelter. She led him inside. Davies, the engineer, took in every detail. He ran his hand over the dry stack wall, noting the tight fit of the stones. He examined the canvas door system, understanding immediately the principle of the airlock it created. He peered into the fire hole, recognizing the efficiency of the design. He paced the interior of the cave, his eyes scanning the dry floor, the high ceiling, the smoke-free air. He placed a hand on the back wall. It was radiating a gentle, persistent warmth. "Remarkable," he said, more to himself than to her. He began to speak, using the language of his profession. "You've maximized the thermal inertia of the limestone. The southern exposure gives you passive solar gain, and the mass of the rock stores that energy. This fire pit, it's a near-perfect updraft gasifier, clean combustion, minimal fuel waste." He looked at her, his professional skepticism replaced by genuine admiration. "Mrs. Finch, where did you learn to do this?" "My husband was a geologist," she said simply. "He taught me to read the land." Davies was silent for a moment. "Your husband was Thomas Finch? He did the initial geological surveys for our company's northern claim. His work was impeccable." He paused. "I was reviewing those files last week. The company has the original deed to his private parcel, the one your cabin is on. It's signed by Thomas Finch and filed with the county clerk in 1899. Ilara felt the world shift slightly on its axis. "My brother-in-law, Silas, he had a deed," she said. "He said Thomas signed it over to him." "I would be very interested to see that document," Davies said, his voice quiet but firm. "Because according to the official record, that property belongs to the estate of Thomas Finch, which is to say, it belongs to you and your children." He saw the ledger book on the stone shelf where she recorded her supplies. "Is that your husband's hand?" he asked, pointing to the geological notes. She nodded. "The signature on a forged document often fails to capture the rhythm of a person's natural script," he said. "I believe a comparison would be illuminating." The expert had arrived. He had not come to rescue her. He had come to validate her, to translate her lived experience into a language the world of men and law would be forced to understand. The reckoning was a quiet, administrative affair, much like the cruelty that had started it all. Arthur Davies was a man who understood how systems worked, and he put them into motion with quiet efficiency. He sent a wire to the company's legal department in Denver, along with a carefully traced copy of Thomas's signature from the ledger and a description of the deed Silas had produced. He then paid a visit to the county sheriff, a man who owed his position more to the mining company's goodwill than to any electoral mandate. Davies laid out the facts, not as a request, but as a statement of corporate interest. A clear case of fraud had been committed against the widow of a respected former employee. It was bad for morale, bad for productivity, and bad for the company's reputation. 2 days later, a federal marshal arrived on the morning stage from Leadville. He was a tall, grim-faced man who did not waste time on pleasantries. He, along with the now highly motivated sheriff, found Silas overseeing the loading of ore carts at the mine. They arrested him on the spot, in front of the assembled miners. The charge was fraud. Silas, who had built his small empire on bluster and intimidation, crumbled. Faced with the evidence, the conflicting deeds, the expert testimony of a handwriting analyst procured by the company, and the quiet, unassailable fact of Ilara's survival, he confessed. Mr. Abernathy brought the news up to the cave himself, his face alight with a satisfaction he did not try to hide. Ilara listened, her expression unreadable. There was no triumph in her, no joy at Silas's downfall, There was only a quiet sense of an equation being balanced. The injustice had been named, and it had been answered. That was all. The mining company, eager to resolve the situation and impressed by Davies's report on Ilara's practical genius, made her an offer. They formally restored her title to the cabin and the land, clear of all liens. They offered a cash settlement of $500 as compensation for her hardship, and, most remarkably, they offered her a job. Arthur Davies wanted to hire her as a consultant, at a salary of $30 a month, to oversee the winterization of the company's housing. He wanted her to teach the miners' families what she knew, how to build what he had termed the Finch-Davies thermal enclosure for their doorways, how to improve the efficiency of their stoves, how to manage their fuel. Her knowledge, born of desperation, had been given a name and a value. She accepted. That spring, when the snows finally melted and the first green shoots of mountain laurel appeared, Ilara and her children walked down from Sentinel Peak for the last time. They moved back into their cabin. The space felt impossibly large and luxurious after the compact security of the cave. But something had changed. The cabin was her house, but the cave, the sun pocket, remained her home. It was the place that had saved them. It was the place she had built. She did not abandon it. Once a week, she would walk the 2 miles up the mountain. She swept the stone floor clean. She ensured the dry stack wall was sound. She kept a small, neat pile of seasoned firewood in the side chamber, along with a sealed tin of matches and a small sack of beans and flour. It was an insurance policy against the fickleness of the world. It was a monument to her own resilience. She had faced the cold, the cruelty, and the calculation of men who saw her as disposable. She had met them all not with pleas or with tears, but with stone and fire and knowledge. She had not been rescued. She had rescued herself. And in doing so, she had become someone her former life could never have produced. A woman who knew the precise architecture of survival, who understood that the surest foundation was the one you built with your own 2